The environmental state of the world is pretty bad. That's really forcing more and more people to ask what next, to look for solutions.
By 2050, if some dramatic action isn't done, there'll be more items of plastic in the world's oceans than living creatures.
We need to commit to not only limiting harm, but we also have a much more proactive approach to the future. We need to find a way to coexist and to be prosperous.
We really need to look at the linear take, make, waste model. We need to look at something different, and we think that that different model could be a circular economy. Circular economy is really based on three principles: to eliminate waste and pollution, to keep products and materials in use for longer, and to regenerate natural systems.
Well, design is a tool. It's a problem-solving tool primarily. Many of the big global issues that we face in today can be addressed by design thinking.
We need you, the brilliant designers of products, packaging, clothing, objects we use every single day to help us create a better future, a more sustainable future, a regenerative future. The beauty of tech is it can act as an accelerator. It's an enabler to support design of new products and new systems, and in turn supports the sustainable change that we simply must make.
Designers have a huge role to play in the shift to a circular economy, but also millions of other people who are involved in the design process. And we estimate that's about 160 million people globally. I would ask designers, business leaders, to look a bit further down the track and ask what the future holds. What policy changes are coming? What are citizens asking for? And what supply chain risks do they expose themselves to if they are constantly dependent on finite resources that come out of a hole in the ground? The circular economy is really about regeneration. So not just reducing the harm and trying to do a bit less bad over time, but actually to have a positive impact, to restore, to regenerate, so that the future gets a bit better rather than just a bit less worse.
SAP solutions touch 77% of the world's material flows. We really are unique in our ability to provide that end-to-end visibility that no other companies can do. Sustainability has, maybe for too long, been an add-on in a business strategy. Through technology, we have the opportunity, and it really is an opportunity to design the processes and databases required for designers everywhere.
And that's really the opportunity here. We can just look around us and say, how could you redesign that for a circular economy?
It's truly time for designers to have the insight that they need to make informed circular design choices and enable the circular economy itself.
Hello, welcome to the food edition of the Circular Design Project Talks, a part of Global Design Forum. I'm Kitty Drake, and I'm a food editor and writer based in London. I've written about food for The Guardian and the Sunday Times, and I'm the winner of the AA Gill Award for Emerging Food Critics. I'm fascinated by food, not just by eating it, although I am very fascinated by eating it, but I'm also really interested in the implications of what we eat and how it affects the economy and wider geopolitics. So I'm really, really excited to be here today to talk with three really astounding innovators about the circular nature of food and how we can work towards a more sustainable future food system. As you've just seen in the video, the overarching ambition of the Circular Design Project, which is a collaboration between the London Design Festival, SAP and the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, is to engage the world's 160 million designers and showcase the positive and measurable impact that can be achieved if business designers and technologists collaborate at scale. That's a really huge aim, and it can be slightly intimidating. But the panelists we have with us today really inspire me because they've begun to change our food system in ways that are not just deeply creative, but are also real life and practical and measurable in some ways. And I want to start by introducing them. So we have Alexander Gillett, the co-founder and the CEO of HowGood, a data company with the world's largest product sustainability database for the food and personal care industries. Under Alexander's leadership, HowGood has provided critical data and insights to retailers and consumers on sustainability and maintained its mission to reduce the impact of food and consumer goods on our world. So we're really excited to have him here. Then we have Marije Vogelzang, who is the head of the Bachelor Department Food Non-Food at the Design Academy Eindhoven. Her work has been published and acknowledged globally, and Marije is a successful speaker at conferences worldwide. In 2016, Marije initiated the Dutch Institute of Food and Design, a global network to celebrate the connection between food and design. The Dutch Institute of Food and Design is behind the Future Food Design Awards and produces a travelling exhibition about the future of food. Then we have Merijn Dols, a circular economy scholar and activist with over 15 years of experience in design, product and packaging innovation. Merijn is leading open innovation in circular economy at the food company Danone, catalysing the adoption of circular economy principles in food and the food industry. So welcome to all three of you. Our conversation today will focus on the challenges of today's food system and the role of design in shifting from a linear take, make, waste system to a circular economy. And I just want to begin by kind of defining what the circular economy is for those who aren't familiar with the term. It's about transitioning to a circular economy, decoupling economic activity from the consumption of finite resources. So it's based on three principles and it's driven by design. So the ideas behind it are to eliminate waste and pollution, to circulate products and materials, and to regenerate nature. And as we know, the food system globally is in a state of crisis. It's responsible for 1/3 of greenhouse gas emissions and half of human-induced pressures on biodiversity. Half of the world's habitable land has now been converted to farm agriculture, and if the food sector continues to operate in the same way, it's estimated that using 2010 as a baseline, an additional 593 million hectares, which is an area roughly the size of India, will be needed to convert to agriculture in order to feed the global population by 2050. So it can be tempting to feel slightly hopeless when faced by those kind of facts, but leading retailers and packaged goods makers have a substantial influence on the food system. In the EU and the UK, for example, 40% of agricultural land use is influenced by the top 10 consumer packaged goods makers and retailers. So this session is really about food and how we can shift from the throwaway economy towards a circular economy, and how we can kind of start to address very urgent questions instead of becoming paralyzed by them. Our panelists see waste and pollution as design flaws rather than inevitable byproducts of the things we make. And that really excites me because it makes me feel like there's hope for our future. They're actively making changes and moving towards solutions. So hopefully we're going to be able to talk about some of that today. So I wanted to start by asking Merijn, what are some of the challenges we face today with the food system?
Thank you. Thank you for the intro and thank you for having me. So the issue, it's been said a few times already, but the issue lies in that linear take, make, dispose model, which is built on the premise of infinite growth. If we look at it, we measure that through GDP growth for the larger economy. But if we look specifically at food, we're aiming at yield growth, which we actually measure in calories that are produced. And so what that has done, that race for yield, that race for calories, is it has created a world in which we are at the heart of many of the social and ecological challenges, because it's largely been achieved through efficiency gains. And efficiency basically means doing more of the same with less. Which that efficiency then in turn drives us to remove, or I should say design out all the redundancies. and to create ever more specialization and ever more centralization, which we've seen so clearly in the food system, which then in turn leads to, for example, the very notion of food as a commodity and the very notion of a cash crop, which basically between the line reads that the other crops are not worth any cash. And so the system today, sure, it's producing enough calories to feed even 10 billion if we weren't wasting 1/3 of it, like you mentioned. However, what we need to ask ourselves is, does it actually provide nutrition? Does it actually provide livelihoods? And if so, to whom? Is it accessible? Is it equitable? And so what we're facing, to your point, is in many ways a design problem, because a system ultimately is just a product or a manifestation of the overarching paradigm, the worldview out of which that system arose. And that paradigm currently is an anthropocentric and a mechanistic one. It sees the world as this giant machine with man at the center as the master of everything. And as such, we've designed nature completely out of the system, including us, human society, as a part of nature. And we've started to create a system that does not fit basically the nonlinear system in which we live, which is nature. Now, just look at one stunning fact from the first EMF report actually on food, the Cities and Circular Economy of Food from back in 2019. For every dollar, euro, pound sterling of revenue that we generate in the food system, we as a society actually incur 2 in cost, one in social cost and one in ecosystem cost. However, as a sector, we also have a tremendous opportunity to become, I would say, a catalytical part of the solution. If we redesign that solution and we define a new intent for the system, because I personally, as an industrial designer, I see design as the intent or the expression of intent, which is what makes me so optimistic, because that means that we can also design for a different intent. And not just me, but the 160 million people that are actually doing food design. They might not identify as such, but they're actually doing food design every day. We have the power to do what we do best, to create new products, new services, new businesses, new business models, and innovate basically our way out of this, innovate with a different intent towards a regenerative food future. So that's what makes me very hopeful.
That's great. Thank you so much. It's a great and optimistic place to start. And I wanted to ask you, Alexander, plants and animals grow naturally. So I suppose, isn't the food system already regenerative?
It's an interesting way to think about it. I think there's the capacity. I think the answer would be yes. But the way that we interact with it changes that. So I think the system we came upon and that we took advantage of was regenerative. And as I think Merijn laid out, and also how you laid out, part of the problem is the way what we've solved for, right? We like to oversimplify complex problems. And so solving for calories, and that is the primary focus, drove us away from looking at all of the different outcomes that happen when you produce something. And so switching to a more holistic view, where you can account for more and more of the outcomes, right? So what we try and do, we say we attempt to track every outcome that can come, but you can't do that. All you can do is track as many as you can. And so, within the HowGood system, we're typically tracking about 250 rather than that one primary, because typically when you make any change, there's going to be some trade-offs, right? And the more that we can create a balanced system that integrates those trade-offs with each other so that we have a healthy full system, the better it will become. But that takes immense complexity, and it takes thinking about things in a way that we haven't really done before in agriculture, except at small scale. The beautiful thing is that we now have it mapped out for how to do it at large scale. And we've shifted the paradigm to, it's no longer a question of can we do this? It's a question of will we do this, right? And that's fundamentally different than where we were even 15 years ago for not just major crops, but an enormous number of the more regional crops that are being grown. We know how we can start to integrate them and have some pretty amazing outcomes.
Wow. Okay, great. So I suppose, Marije, if we can turn to you now, you're a wonderful food designer, a trailblazer in your field. I wanted to ask, is food really designed, and what does it mean to design food, and why is it important?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, Kitty, and a good question to ask, because I know that when I started about 22 years ago, most people thought that because I was a trained designer and I was working on food, people thought that I was making pretty cakes and with, I don't know, those cakes with lots of frills on it. And I think it's interesting because it says a lot about how people perceive what design is. And I tried to explain people that I wasn't really necessarily designing food, because food is already pretty much designed by nature either or by human beings. But I was designing from the act of eating. So I was looking at, what does food really mean? What happens when we look at the history of food, or when we look at how people behave when it comes to food, or the irrationalities that we have when it comes to food. So I started to see my own work as eating design more than food design. But the literal design of food for me already started with agriculture, because that's when people started to interfere with how plants were growing, what kind of DNA would reproduce and what kind of DNA would not reproduce. So in that sense, I think agriculture is already designed. A lot of food that we do eat today is designed, whether that's an orange carrot, which doesn't really exist in the natural world, or a yellow banana, which also doesn't exist in the natural world, or gummy bears, you know, all of this is designed. But I think that is not necessarily the most interesting part about food. I think what is interesting is when you see design as a tool, and when design becomes a tool to have something in front of you, but find a way to lift that and tilt that upside down and to look at it from the other way, to see the backside of something, I think then you can really start to make a change. So whether this banana is yellow or orange, I don't think that's very interesting. I think it's very interesting to see that food is actually only food when someone is eating it. And that means that food is only food in the actual interaction with this human being. Because if you have something which you do not put in your mouth and swallow it, then you actually have waste or decoration or whatever you would do with that. But it's not food. And that means that whenever you do deal with food as a designer, you're also dealing with the human being, with this eating human being. And what is this eating human being about? That's like a vessel full of very irrational emotional behavior that many times doesn't really make a lot of sense. And if you're a designer dealing with that, I think it's very important to look at the act of eating. So what kind of choices does someone make? What kind of expectations do people have? When do they want to actually value food? And when do they easily throw food away? And I think if you look at those kind of patterns for design, then you start to see that, you know, you can make lots of sustainable things, but if the eater doesn't desire these things, then you don't really make a big difference. So I think a lot of that is also about desire.
Yes, I love that point. Just to kind of expand on it a little bit, I think that's so interesting. I know that you work a lot around the psychology of food and how we eat. And I wonder whether you could speak a little bit more about that, about how the kind of work that you're making in order to reshape desire. Do you see what you're doing as a kind of reshaping of desire?
Yes, it could be all a reshaping of perspective. So let me just give you a very straightforward example with my daughter who didn't want to eat her vegetables. And when she was 3 years old, I noticed that every time I put her at the dining table, she would already start to resist eating anything, as if I would go and butcher her instead of feeding her. And that was a very remarkable change. But for me as a mother, it was really hard to deal with. So I read this report stating that children need to taste something 7 times before they can accept a new flavor. It's like learning a new language. You have to repeat and repeat and repeat, and then you just, you get it, you normalize it. So that's one thing. And the other thing is that I noticed that there was this kind of Pavlov reaction of putting her at this dining table. It was a kind of pressured moment for her, or there was a kind of friction there. So I decided to take her together with all the kids from her daycare to my studio. And I told them we're going to do a veggie bling bling workshop. So I had this table full of vegetables, and I told them we're going to play and we're going to make jewelry with one tool, and the tool was their teeth. They have really sharp teeth, so they can easily use those to shape vegetables. So they started to, they made bracelets and rings and all kinds of decoration for themselves. And all these kids, without any hesitation, took the vegetables, started chewing. No one would spit the food out, because for them, it wasn't eating, it was playing. But they were eating because they were chewing, or they were shaping these things. And they were also tasting more than 7 times. So they were feeling very happy about that. And honestly, there was a little boy who made a bracelet, and he was shaping the bracelet, but then he was lost a little bit. So he ate the whole thing. And I asked all the parents afterwards. And after this experience, all these kids were much more happy to start and try new things, just because the situation was different and because they felt that they were playing instead of eating, but they were. And I think this is a very simple example of how you don't always have to design new things. Actually, that's why I started with food, because there's already a lot of things in the world. Sometimes you just need to design a different scenario or a different setting for things to take place. And to see these teeth as tools can be very helpful and very simple as well.
I love that. Thank you. Wonderful. So I wanted to ask Merijn, what is the impact of a circular economy within the food industry? How will we see the benefits both within nature and with our relationship with food? And I suppose this follows on from the points that you're making, Marije, because it's about kind of changing our relationship with food and changing something that we feel is inevitable about the way we consume. So Merijn.
Yeah, first of all, thank you, Marije, for I have 3 little girls at home, and I'm sure I'm going to find myself this evening with a house full of edible jewelry. So thank you very much for that. Yeah, I ended on this in my previous answer. The food industry, more than any other industry, can and should be an integral part of nature. And if anybody needs data, just look at Project Drawdown. Now, the restorative and ultimately after restorative, the regenerative potential of the sector is immense. And I would say it's beyond any other sector. However, to do that, as I mentioned before, we need to change the way we view the world. And we need to change that worldview from which the system came. From, again, what I mentioned before, that mechanistic way of looking with people at the center towards an ecocentric living systems view. Now, if we come back to the notion of design as the expression of intent, to me, what that means is that we will need to adopt new, or actually they're not even new, I would say we need to re-adopt all design philosophies, like agroecology, like agrobiodiversity, agroforestry, regenerative agriculture. We hear them everywhere, but I would say what they are is they're design philosophies, and they're all design philosophies that are basically anchored in that ecocentric worldview. And they're all expressions of living systems design, which to me also explains why there is this renewed appreciation of indigenous food systems. Indigenous food systems, for me, simply have never moved away from that ecocentric paradigm. They've remained anchored in this idea of human as a part of a living system. And they've never moved to that worldview where we dominate the system and where we disconnect basically the economy from nature. So I think that if we come back to my first answer, this disconnect leads to these externalities that I mentioned. Now, also to Marije's point, I think the holistic nature of indigenous food systems also meant that people remain connected to their food and where their food basically comes from. Because on the one hand side, if I look at this from a system lens, a nonlinear system strives for dynamic stability, and it achieves that through effectiveness rather than the efficiency I mentioned before. And as such, a circular economy aims to optimize the system as a whole, and it works effectively at every scale. So for food, we look at local, regional, and global, which is what makes it resilient. And on the other hand side, it allows for a deeper connection to our food, because food is not just a source of nutrients. It's not just, which we actually also sometimes forget, but our first line of defense for a healthy life, but it's also an integral part of our identity. I just was looking it up quickly, but 70% of Gen Z and millennials take pictures of their food before eating it. And roughly 30 to 40% of all the Instagram content is food related. In other words, I would argue that we identify through food. We create memories through food. And even we can travel through food when, like now, a pandemic makes actual travel impossible. And so that's where I think we're going to see the impact, both in nature and in society.
And so you're saying you almost see a positive to the Instagram through the looking glass situation that we're in now, because people are identifying more heavily with what they eat, and so more kind of exciting and seismic change is possible.
Absolutely. People saw two things right now. They saw, first of all, what a mechanistic system that becomes very fragile does when it, how fragile it is when it is exposed to shock, where the just-in-time system basically broke down. On the other hand side, because people were basically forced to stay in place, shelter in place, go in lockdown, they started to reconnect to their very own backyard. Sometimes literally, people started to cook their own food again. They started to grow their own food again. But also you saw CSA shares on the rise. People started connecting to the farm in their neighborhood again. They started to rediscover where their food comes from. Chicken doesn't grow in a styrofoam package. And I think in that sense, yes, it has also had its positive effects if we can hang on to them.
Yes, big if. And Alexander, I suppose this starts with farmers, perhaps. So seeing as that's where most of our food comes from, how can we support farmers to consider regenerative production?
I mean, it depends who we is. So as consumers, there's a lot of different tools. Merijn just laid out some of them, right? CSAs, going direct to farm is always going to be your best option for supporting a farmer. You see a farm stand, pull over. It makes a big difference. So much of the value of that food gets distributed across different players and rarely makes it back to the farmers. And one of the things that we're trying to do, and many people are trying to do, is when a farmer shifts their practices, to actually shift the dollar value of that food, because it's often seen at the far end. So when it's sold in a grocery store, an ingredient will be sold for more, but the farmer doesn't always see that difference, even though they're the one doing the practice. So, there's a number of things that you can do. The local, the old adage of act local, think global very much applies to the food system. But again, you also want to start to look at companies that are talking and making changes, right? So shifting, you're going to see the word regenerative a lot, right? And it's this idea that, sustainable is not a very inspirational goal. It's net zero, right? If you think about yourself on a scale of degenerative, negative impact, and to sustainable is basically like saying, I've had no impact on this world. And as a person, that's probably not how you want to be on your deathbed. You want to say, I made this world a better place. I made my family happy. I improved systems, right? So sustainable is the midway, didn't do harm. Regenerative is this idea that we're improving things, right? We're sequestering carbon. We are improving waterways, right? We can go through this long list of all these different outcomes. And what we need is whenever people see companies reaching for that they get our support. And what we've seen in HowGood is that two things that I find very inspirational. One, companies are already wanting to do this. Some of the biggest players in the world are signing up to our system to reformulate their products and understand how to make those changes. But so are customers, right? So within the US, we have sustainability ratings that actually go right next to the price tag in grocery stores. And we see a 250% increase in sales for a best rated product when you put them on a scale, on a sustainability scale, right? In baby food, we see over 1,000%. And if you break it up by the generations, every next generation is basically more and more willing to spend a higher percentage based on their values. And the same is true in Europe. You're not using our system, but if you're looking at EcoScore or any of the different players, they're seeing a similar numbers. That when you create transparency and clarity, your customers drive towards that. But it has to be simple. So one of the challenges that we often face is the complexity of understanding what something means. And this is why scales that accurately reflect the food system are really good, because they put everything next to each other so you can compare them. In the US, we have this example of, if you're looking to buy eggs, there's cage-free, free range, free roaming, certified humane, and USDA organic, right? And if you ask anyone to define the difference between those 5 standards and conventional, they can't. Even the people working in the industry get them switched up, right? And that confusion leads to people feeling like there's false information out there, right? And that they don't know if they're putting their dollars towards actually improving systems or if they're being duped, and so then they don't spend it. But if you only carry one of those in the grocery store, and you should make sure it's the best one, but if you only carry one, so there isn't that confusion, you see a big leap in the sales. And so the things that we implement need to be standardized and simplified so that people don't have to have PhDs to understand the differences. So whether you're, when you're working as a farmer, find the partners that are starting to pay more and that are trying to change these practices. Because just as much as farmers need the support from CPGs are looking for farmers who are ready to make these changes. And so it's this interaction between the two and making those connections, and then helping them make the right choices that again, are less trade-offy and more net positive.
Great, thank you so much. I feel like there's a lot of practical things that we can all be doing, which is empowering. And Marije, from a design perspective, what can designers do to support the public to make those kind of informed decisions that Alexander's been outlining for us, and to raise awareness of the fact that we have options and that we can make an impact with our choices?
Yeah, I think it's very important for designers also to understand that it requires a different attitude to work with food or a regenerative system. Like you're not like, if you're a designer making products, like you're this god and then you create something and it's finished and that's it, right? But when you work with food or with a living system or with something of organic matter, your position is different. You need to kind of respect this living system and you need to respond to it. You need to tend to it. So in that way, you're more of a gardener as a designer. And I think this is it also requires a little bit of less arrogance, perhaps, being a designer working with food. So I think that is very important for designers to understand, that they also need to reassess their own position. It's very easy to take a material, to force your idea on top of it, and then to create this thing and don't think about where it will go to when it's finished. So I think for designers, looking at your own attitude is the first place to start, but then also to look at consumers that you might be creating for. The thing is that we feel that the designer is creating something, and then the consumer is kind of passive and is consuming the thing that you would create. And I think this might not be a healthy relationship. I think the passiveness of a consumer doesn't really help to increase or sensitize someone, to increase the feeling of the value of food. Because essentially, if I'm sure we can create lots of amazing utopian scenarios, systems, and designs for consumers, but if we do not activate consumers or enable this activation and see them as kind of passive actors in this, well, an actor is not passive, but passive components, I think that's really it's really useless. So I would suggest for designers to not tell people what to do, but to create, perhaps sometimes using a paradox from the food system, not telling them what is right or what is wrong, but to create a platform for consumers to enter or to step onto, and to feel as if they are also a part of it. Because so many times people do not feel that they're part of the food system. People do not feel engaged at all with these kind of things. And especially if you use the word sustainable, then they fall asleep anyway. So yes, that you as a creative have the tools to make projects that allow for others to step into, to feel that you're a part of that. I think that is very important. So to make projects that are engaging, that are interactive, that you can experience. For example, I did a project about tap water. In the Netherlands, we have amazing tap water, but most people, they clean their cars with it and they flush it through the toilet. And we think about tap water as something that we do need to save. We shouldn't spill it, but we actually do it because we don't really care about it. But no one talks about the flavor of tap water. But we have one of the purest tap waters in the world. And tap water is different from every capital city to the other of all the 12 provinces. So if you would put all these tap waters together, then you can create a tap water tasting. So when you start this narrative about the flavor of tap water, and when you start to compare flavors as if you would do a wine tasting, then suddenly the appreciation for water and also the sensitivity for the flavor of water really increases. And then you see that tap water is actually a magical thing that we should be so grateful of having. But most people really do not ever think about how amazing it is that we have tap water in our house. So creating scenarios that help people to feel in awe of the food system, because we should be in awe of the food system. It is incredible. It's amazing that we have so many amazing kinds of varieties of food available for us for a very reasonable price. I think we need to really start with making people understand how incredible that is. And only then, when you can help people to sensitize themselves, then you can go to the next step and activate people to make different choices. But first, you need to make sure that people start to care about things in the first place.
So kind of restoring the wonder, bringing back the sense of wonder.
Absolutely, yeah. Because we want to pay a lot of money for wine. We want to talk about wine.
Yeah, exactly. I like that idea. Okay, well, I think I'd like to kind of finish the session because unfortunately we're running out of time, which is very sad. We have COP26, an important UN climate change conference coming up in November. So I thought perhaps as our final thoughts, you could each share with me what you think is needed to create change ahead of COP26 and how we can move a kind of point on how, a finishing point on how a practical thing we could do to move towards a regenerative food system with that milestone in mind. So perhaps, Merijn, we could start with you.
That's a tough question.
Yeah, it's a bit of a big
well, it's a big question, and in a way, it's what might make it overwhelming, and which is why I want to stress one point, which is I've talked quite a lot about different systems. And one thing to realize about natural nonlinear systems, which we also call complex adaptive systems, is that they change through emergence. Now that is actually really powerful because it simply means that all we have to do is start experimenting. This whole idea of we can predict what change is going to have a big impact comes from, again, that mechanistic worldview. And so if we just need to start experimenting, then I love the concept of systems acupuncture. Try to find the nodes where needles have a disproportionate impact. And for me, those nodes are in the financial system. And there was an announcement, for instance, last Tuesday at the New York Stock Exchange of a new asset class that actually captures the positive externalities that can be generated through regenerative agriculture or through agroforestry into the financial market. And then on the other side, if I look at us as innovators, I think what we need to do is we need to shift our culture, and we need to shift away from a risk-averse culture much more to a culture of innovation in which we not only celebrate success, but we actually simply experiment, because it is a high risk and a high failure rate game. And so if we only celebrate success, we're actually telling people between the lines not to try. And we need to do so also in a spirit of reciprocity. So we need to move away from the closed, not invented here mindset. Because for me, innovation ultimately is the serendipitous collision of seemingly unrelated ideas. And no one organization, let's take Danone, we have 1,700 people working in innovation. No, even 1,700 people aren't going to cut it if we really want to innovate our way out of the predicament that we're in. We're going to need to work together, and we're going to need to make sure that as many ideas flow freely, that our organizations become porous, and so that we get really breakthrough ideas that start to emerge and start to shift the system. But what I would close on is this notion of it's not about size, it's not about one big change, it's about every one of the 160 million food designers that we just identified today to simply start experimenting towards a regenerative future with a different design intent.
Love that. Great, thank you. And Alexander, could we hear from you?
Yeah, I mean, Merijn, it's hard not to just reiterate exactly what you said. You know, there's such an intertwined component of the financial and the outcomes. I think the more, you know, you often hear this idea of kind of like, how do we offer loans to farmers that are making these changes, or talk about like incentivizing farmers? But I think we also need to incentivize, both through the markets and through internal changes within companies, how people are rewarded based on the externalities. So if someone is able to help dramatically shift a carbon outcome, that should be as valuable as the what's happening within the financials. Once we make that kind of shift where companies are actively rewarding people within their organizations for making changes, you're going to see the acceleration of changes and the ability to for them to solve the problems that we could spend, you know, hours here listing out all the different problems we need to solve, right? But really what we want is enough people working on them to solve them, right? So how do we reward that so that the people who are making those changes can be successful in them? I think is a huge part. And a big part of that as well is starting to agree upon how we start to measure things. It's more important that we're measuring them than we're measuring them exactly right or exactly the same way, right? Because people are so focused on this idea of perfect data that they forget that right now we're just not using data. We're basically using gut right now and our feeling about these companies, because so many people are saying, well, that data isn't perfect. Is it farm to gate? Is it right? All these different pieces. And it's like, well, let's measure what we have and where we have it and start making decisions with that data. And then the companies that are doing a better job will start providing more data, and that will become the new norm. And so that's the shift that we are very aggressively trying to push and get companies to just start doing, right? Declare the numbers of where you are now and where you're going to be in 5 years, and we'll hold you accountable. Let's see how that goes. Oh, I think you're muted.
I was just saying, great, that sounds good and threatening in a good way. And Marije, if we could just finish with you, we're nearly out of time, so I'm sorry to rush you, but it'd be great to have your thoughts.
Yeah, well, I keep it short because I think Merijn and Alexander already said so many wonderful things that I absolutely agree with. And below that, I believe that we can use design to help people to find this magic back with food, because food is not just the bottom of the Maslow pyramid. And I think especially design can help to pull that up through all these levels, where food is also a part of your identity, where food is your psychology, where food is making you healthy, where food in your gut is actually telling you how you behave. It has so many so big an influence on our life, and we seem to kind of neglect that. We're just focusing on all these little parts of food, or we're not even focusing on food. We're actually watching screens and we're touching our devices more than anything that's alive. And I think food is this kind of bridge between us, the digital world, and the living world. And so using food as the kind of accelerator to live a more rich life in all senses makes us also make different choices for food. And so I think that's really where we should start.
Thank you so much. That's a lovely way to end.